Thank you, Dan, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to EDA for inviting me back. Leanne, how many years has this been already? 6, 7, 8? I don't know. It is always wonderful being back with this crowd, not only because of the spirit and energy you folks bring to the provincial economy, but just because of the many friends that I've developed over the last several years being part of this conference. And the chance to reconnect with a lot of you as I travel around the province into your individual towns and cities and communities. So I really do feel a wonderful part, really, of EDA, and it's always nice to be invited back. Last night after dinner I was chatting, a group of us were chatting, and someone said, "You only have good news for us tomorrow morning, right?" And I said, "I promise to bring only good news." So that concludes my remarks for this morning. I gotta stop using that show. I wish it were that easy. We actually have some, pretty tough news in our economy now that we're in April of 2016. The title of my presentation, So Now What? A short, medium, and long-term trends for Alberta's economy. Someone asked me once, where do you get all your crazy ideas and your inspirations for your presentations? There are always these crazy photos, and where do you get your ideas? And I thought that's a good question. But I was looking through this big box of things I had saved actually just a couple of weeks ago from my childhood, and I was going through these things. I was a bit of a pack rat as a child. I like to kind of collect things. And back in 1976, my mother gave me this. Now this is the actual Eaton's catalog from spring-summer 1976. And she said, this is the last Eaton's catalog they are producing. After this, that's it. No more Eaton's catalog. She said, this will be a collector's item. You should stick this away in a box. So at 9 years old, I thought, I'm going to stick this away. And in 40 years, this is going to be worth tens of thousands of dollars. Well, my predictions in how much paraphernalia like this is worth not very good. I don't think this is worth anything, but it was a lot of fun actually to pull this out of that box and flip through it. And the Eaton's catalog from spring-summer 1976 actually helped inspire the presentation. Because as I was flipping through it, several things kind of struck me. One is trying to predict trends, where things are going, is pretty difficult, especially in the world of fashion. This gal here, well, I don't know. These are the men's suits. I really like these. But $85, right? For that middle one, that's a sweet suit. And actually, as you flip through this catalog, it's quite... Did you know that in 1976, in Eaton's catalog, there was a whole page of guns you could buy? They really were. They were like shotguns or rifles. But you could buy anything. You could buy like boats and furniture and all kinds of things. But one of the trends, I think, the Eaton's company, obviously what they did not foresee is that within 20 years of this last catalog coming out, they would cease to exist as a company. But in 1976, Eaton's obviously thought the trend in retail is going towards bricks and mortar, building more shopping malls, and that's why they abandoned the catalog in 1976. Canadians weren't buying things through catalogs. So they thought the trend was going to bricks and mortar, but what you can forgive them for missing is that 40 years later in 2016, the world's #7 retailer has no bricks or mortar at all. Amazon has kind of brought back, in a way, catalog shopping. Not with a physical paper catalog, but online. Now in 1976, it would have been nearly impossible kind of to predict some of those trends in the economy. Travel. This painting here was from a French futurist. This is from 1950, and this was what they anticipated the 21st century looking like. That there would be interplanetary travel, and that we'd be flying around in flying automobiles, and everyone would have their own personal spaceship. Well, I actually do know one astronaut, Robert Thirsk. He's the chancellor at the University of Calgary. Other than him, I don't know anyone who's been in a rocket or who's been to outer space. But in 1950, they thought, well, surely this will be common. I really like the little ladder, the little steps up to the spaceship. It all looks kind of simple. But in 1950, what futurists foresaw were trends in transportation, and what they maybe didn't see as much are trends in communication. They kind of got it wrong. Some things they did get right. This here was some futurists. This, I think, drawing was from 1958. But this was a drawing of driverless cars. Well, in 1958, this seemed like science fiction. Actually, in 2016, it still seems a bit like science fiction, but this is all coming, right? We know that driverless cars are going to be a trend in the future. But what they didn't see right, so they got the driverless car right, but you see them in the background, or in the back seat there, the family, they're having a little party. Well, that's, I guess, what parties in 1958, what they anticipated parties would look like. In 2016, this is what parties really look like. And it's true, we all do this. You see people, best party ever. So again, what they missed was they maybe got some of the bits of the transportation right with the driverless cars, but not too many futurists 30 or 50 or 100 years ago really foresaw that we would all be walking around with these $500 pieces of glass in our pockets that we absolutely cannot, sort of function or live without. It was the trends and developments and progress in communication that were not quite as obvious back in the 1950s. And then a last picture, these are just for fun. This is sort of distance learning, what they envisioned back in the 50s. Some of this is kind of right. I mean, the idea of distance learning online with a tablet in front of you, they kind of got that idea right. But what they didn't get quite right is they still envisioned a classroom setting, a very traditional classroom, with someone standing at the front and people lined up kind of in a lecture theater with their pads. What they didn't really foresee is that distance learning could happen anywhere, that you wouldn't have to necessarily be in a classroom. So these pictures were just for fun, but that Eaton's catalog from 1976 really got me thinking about trends, trying to predict trends, trying to make forecasts of where things are going, and the perils sometimes of trying to make trends, or trying to make forecasting where trends are going. So where are things going? So now what for Alberta's economy? Here we are in April 2016 in the middle of another economic downturn. These things kind of come and go, but this one is turning out to be a bit of a nastier, longer drawn out affair than some of the recessions that we've been used to over the last few decades. This one is starting to feel a lot like the 1980s. I get that comparison a lot. People are saying, ooh, this is worse than the 80s. I would say yes and no. I mean, I was alive during the 80s. I didn't hold a mortgage in the 1980s. There are similarities and comparisons, of course, but there's a lot of differences too. What I want to do this morning is talk about where Alberta's economy is going and try to foresee those longer, medium, and short-term trends to try to get a feel of perhaps where we're going as a province and when we might emerge from this current downturn. Before I do that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about the U.S. economy. I'm going to set aside some of the other global countries, China and Europe, simply because of time. But I do this presentation, I want to spend a bit more time talking about the U.S. economy, really interesting things happening there. And of course, as always, to understand where the Canadian economy is going, we need to understand what's happening with our friends south of the border. Because while China and Europe and emerging markets, they have a huge influence, especially on energy prices, what happens in the United States still, to the largest degrees, kind of sets the tone here north of the border. And then I will spend some time talking about the broader Canadian economy, what the Bank of Canada is thinking these days, and then we'll return to this province, talk about energy prices, and I'll offer some of the long, medium, and short-term trends and forecasts for Alberta's economy. So let's start then with our friends from the south, the United States, our BFFs as I like to call them. What's going on in the US economy these days and how might that inform what's happening on this side of the border? Well, the good news, there's good news and bad news and good news with the US economy right now. The good news is that over the last 5 years, the US economy has continued to add a tremendous number of new jobs. Very consistently, month over month, they've added about 200,000 new jobs. And when they came out of that nasty recession, you might remember back in 2010, 2011, when they were just kind of crawling out of it. They needed to get that unemployment rate down, they were looking to they had to add about 200,000 new jobs every month. That's just to sort of accommodate new people coming into the job market. But more than 200,000 would then start to move that unemployment rate down. And that actually is what they have seen, very consistent job growth over the last 5 years. Their unemployment rate, which had peaked out at 10.2%, is now a very comfortable 5% unemployment. And that's sort of where, for a long time, the Federal Reserve had wanted to see it. Once it gets down to 5 or 5.5%, Well, they're squarely in that range right now at 5% unemployment. So that's the good news. There has been consistent, strong job growth in the US. The bad news is that the quality of jobs perhaps isn't as strong as what you would hope. Wage growth in the United States has been entirely flat. And there's been a lot of slack. In other words, when that downturn in 08, 09, 010, or 2010 happened, there were a lot of discouraged workers who just kind of vanished into the population. They dropped out of the job market, out of the labor force altogether. Well, now that the US economy has been creating jobs, what's been happening is it's been pulling those disenfranchised or discouraged workers back into the job market. And that's been able to keep, it's great news for employers, but it's been able to keep wage growth essentially flat. So yes, while there are a lot of new jobs being created, wage growth has been flat. Oh, I hope this is gin. Yeah. Oh, it's not gin. Maybe later. So while there's been a lot of jobs created, wage growth has been essentially flat, and that still caused some concern that the US economy is not quite performing, you know. In fact, in 2016, things maybe are even slowing down a little bit. So that's the bad news. The good news, so there's good news, bad news, good news, is that the Federal Reserve is now taking a go slow approach with raising interest rates. Back in the fall of 2015, they were basically saying, get ready because interest rates, we're gearing up now, the economy's momentum is picking up steam, we're going to start raising interest rates. They increased interest rates in December. That was the first rate increase in the US in almost 10 years. And they were kind of indicating that in 2016 there would be consistent, followed up with consistent rate increases throughout the year. Well, now that we're well into 2016 and it's looking like, well, you know, maybe the US economy isn't picking up quite as much steam. Things are still looking good. But the Federal Reserve has kind of shifted their position a little bit. And now they're saying we're going to take our time and monitor this very carefully. And now markets are really only expecting probably 2 more rate increases to come in 2016. So I would consider this good news because I think it shows on the Federal Reserve's part their understanding, or at least their willingness to accept the fact that if we start raising rates too quickly, we jump the gun on this, we're going to choke off the still kind of fragile, you know, recovery in the US economy. So I think the Fed is probably correct in its assessment that the US economy, while it's still advancing, they can't go too quickly with these rate increases. So as a result, I do see growth. Last year, the United States topped growth of all G8 countries. It had the fastest growing economy, well ahead of the Canadian economies, in fact. 2016, we might see a little bit of a reversal of that. I think the US economy might pull back just a bit, the Canadian economy pulling up a bit, and probably the two economies will be growing at about the same rate. But the other interesting thing going on in the United States right now, yeah. Well, and it's kind of hard in some ways to even really talk about this because, you know, I think everyone is sitting back watching this reality show that you can't even, you know, the best writers couldn't write a show this good. And while on the surface, you know, a lot of it is kind of entertaining and we make a lot of fun of Mr. Trump and not just him, but the other cast and crew of, you know, what's going on in American politics. But, you know, as an economist, it's impossible for me, I'm not a political analyst, far be it from me to make any predictions of what's going to happen. But I would suggest that, you know, a lot hangs in the balance for the US and the Americans' longer-term economic prospect with what's going on right now. Now, even if Mr. Trump isn't successful in his bid for the White House this year, and I think most people would say he's not going to win this thing. But even if he doesn't win and we end up with somebody else in the White House, the problems for the United States haven't really gone away. Mr. Trump has tapped into a level of discontent and anger and rage in that country that isn't going to vanish if he loses his bid. In fact, if he loses, it might make it worse. And whoever ends up in the White House cannot ignore what's going on in their social and political system in the United States. Now again, I'm not a political analyst. I don't understand much about the sociology of disenfranchised people. But there is an economic imperative to get this right for the US. Because if Mr. Trump wins, or even if he doesn't, but there's this growing discontent and millions of Americans who are finding a voice in a very angry, kind of nasty person, you know, longer term, I think this has implications for the United States as the world's largest economy, as a place that has attracted a lot of investment and a lot of capital. Longer term, what does it say about that country, and what does it say about our largest trading partner? So I only, you know, make this sort of suggestion that the U.S. will have to try to pay attention and have to try to get this right, because if too many people are excluded from the American dream, that in the longer term, I think, spells bad news for our friends to the south. All right, let's talk about the Canadian economy now, and here we have actually a little bit of better news. The Canadian economy these days looking a little bit brighter than it looked back in 2015, where it was still kind of hobbling along. January, we saw real GDP growth in Canada shoot up 0.6% on a month-over-month. Now, for non-economists, you know, 0.6%, it doesn't sound like a lot. But if you annualize that, if that rate of growth continued over 12 months, the Canadian economy will have grown by 5%. That's getting close to Chinese levels of growth. You know, and a lot of people, their eyeballs kind of bugged out when they saw that number in January, because it came as a bit of a surprise. Remember, it was only in January when the Bank of Canada, markets were sort of expecting the Bank of Canada could, you know, actually lower interest rates because of the weakness, the perceived weakness in the Canadian economy. In the meantime, quietly in the background, the economy was growing at 0.6% and surprised everybody when we got those numbers out in March. So the Canadian economy now finally starting to show some signs of life. Finally, the one piece of that GDP formula, exports, it looks like it's now starting to kick in, helped out tremendously by the low Canadian dollar and the reviving US economy. But for a long time, it was those Canadian exports. That was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle. And it was a head scratcher for a lot of economists, because we thought, well, eventually these, you know, exports have to kick in. But 2014, 2015, you know, they really failed to materialize. Finally now, it looks like exports from Canada are starting to pick up, at least manufacturing exports from central Canada. So the Canadian economy hobbling along all right. We had a jobs report out this morning showing good, solid job growth for the Canadian economy. I'll talk about the Alberta report in just a minute. You think it was April Fool's Day, how strong the Alberta report was. That's a different story. But the Canadian economy in March added 41,000 new jobs. The unemployment rate actually ticked down a little bit. Still stuck above 7% though nationally. So we've got a ways to go before we match the US economy in terms of their labor market. But things now seem to be picking up a wee bit of momentum. And I think it's enough for the Bank of Canada to, you know, take some of that fear that the Bank of Canada might actually cut rates. That was the fear back in January. But going forward, I think the Bank of Canada, too, they will also take their time. I don't think they're going to be too trigger happy with raising rates. We'd have to see probably 4 or 6 more months of very impressive GDP growth and inflation pressure starting to pick up before the Bank of Canada would say, well, now is the time we have to start talking about raising interest rates. I don't think we're there yet. The Bank of Canada, of course, the single focus for the Bank of Canada is what inflation pressures are doing. They look at all these other things, of course, you know, GDP growth and exports and the value of the dollar, but at the end of it, it really is their target for inflation. And there is no inflation pressures building in the Canadian economy, really whatsoever. Not in terms of a general consumer price pressure. There are certain things, you know, fresh fruits and vegetables, of course, they were costing a lot more. In fact, it's kind of funny, about a month ago, I don't think this holds true anymore, but about a month ago, someone pointed out that 4 heads of cauliflower cost more than a barrel of oil. So I don't know if we should laugh or cry at that, but it was probably true. These days, probably not as true. I mean, we're still seeing some high prices on imported fruits and vegetables, but even that is probably starting to dissipate now that the Canadian dollar has stabilized and clawed its way up a little higher. But general price inflation in Canada is more or less absent. There's not really this, you know, sense that inflation is rising simply because Canadians are earning more money and we're all out in the shopping malls and the auto dealers and, you know, buying all this stuff. That kind of inflation pressure is not what we're seeing in the Canadian economy right now. We're still seeing, aside from today's good job report, kind of a sluggish labor market. And we're only starting to see now the signs of those exports picking up. So I think the Bank of Canada, they're going to be quite content sitting on the sidelines probably for the rest of 2016 before they would gauge it's time to start raising rates. My guess is we won't see rate increases until 2017. But you never know. If we did see a bunch of consecutive increases in GDP and inflation pressure starting to tick up, we could see the bank raise rates maybe toward the end of 2016. But my guess is it'll probably be well into 2017 before borrowing costs in Canada go up. And just a quick little note on the Canadian dollar. A lot of people really interested these days with what's going on with our little loonie. My guess is that the Canadian dollar will continue to kind of track what oil prices are doing. Now, the Canadian dollar has always been a little bit of a petrocurrency, but more so in the last year. It's really almost moved in direct sympathy with that price of oil, more so than it did previously. And I think that will continue for the next little while. As oil prices go up and down, I think the Canadian dollar will as well. And I'll talk about oil, I think, in the next slide. But I don't really see a lot of strength for the Canadian dollar, not at least until probably the latter part of 2016, if we see more growth in the Canadian economy and more signals from the Bank of Canada that they're finally looking to raise rates. So my guess is that dollar will, continue to fluctuate between that 72 and 78 cent range, always with some fluctuation, before probably returning above 80 cents in 2017. Now that might still sound like kind of a weak price level, but historically, if you go back over the last 40 years, the average for the Canadian dollar is about 82 cents. So even where we're at right now, what is it, about 76 cents? We're below that long-term average, but not tremendously below it. It only kind of feels like we have a weak dollar because between the years 2010 and 2014, we somehow got used to this notion that the Canadian dollar trades at par or above par with the US dollar, which is historically very, very unusual. So it's returned more to kind of historic normal levels. I think it will continue to be on the soft side of that with softer energy prices, at least in 2016, but probably a little bit of strength returning next year. All right, so let's talk about energy prices before we focus in on what's going on in Alberta. Because, of course, as everyone in this room knows, the drop in oil prices has been the single reason why Alberta was flung into recession last year and likely to continue in this year as well. There really aren't any other negatives going on right now for the Canadian or for Alberta's economy. It has all to do with the drop of oil prices. Gas prices have remained low, so that's added to the misery, but that hasn't really changed. What has changed is the drop in these oil prices from $107, almost 2 years ago, by the way. I mean, it was June 2014. So we actually have to start thinking about, this downturn in oil prices is almost 2 years old. To where it's at today, around $36, $37 a barrel, rebounding. Well, where are oil prices going? They're going to go up, and then they're going to go down, and then they're going to go strongly up, and then they're going to come way down, and this is going to continue forever. And there's not really going to be a lot of rhyme or reason to how this happens, and oil prices are notoriously difficult to predict. And largely because, there is that supply and demand, sort of fundamental that works in the background. Countries need oil and countries supply oil, and that's actually fairly easy to predict. What isn't easy to predict? How are OPEC nations and leaders of those countries going to react to certain things? So when you start to bring the politics and the geopolitics of OPEC into it, and then it gets complicated with, really crazy to predict countries like Russia and, all of these crazy moving parts in the global energy markets, and these oil prices become very, very difficult to kind of pin down at all. But my guess is, and it is only a guess, that for the first half, maybe well into the summer or even early fall of 2016, these oil prices are going to continue to struggle, probably being a bit range-bound between $30 and $40 a barrel, kind of right where they're at right now. Now, my only reason for believing that is currently we are seeing a lot of daily volatility in these oil prices. They can shoot up easily $1, $2, sometimes almost $3 a day, only to come, sliding back down the very next day. There doesn't seem to be any real direction in markets right now. And that is because investors and the traders on Wall Street, They're listening to all these crazy press releases from OPEC countries saying that, well, yeah, we've agreed to meet to possibly talk about perhaps, limiting supply. Oh, and oil prices go. Then the next day, Saudi Arabia will say, well, we're not limiting supply if Iran doesn't limit supply. And then all these oil prices come back down. And this is not the fundamental supply and demand that works in the background to support prices. This is the geopolitics of it. And it's really, really difficult to predict. And the market at the moment doesn't really seem to have much direction. But I do think that by the end of 2016, I'm still anticipating that we will see some modest price recovery for crude oil. That's only because those fundamentals in the background, the supply and demand, they're still always there. And at a certain point, pressures within that supply and demand do kind of trump the daily, geopolitics of what an OPEC leader is saying. And I think we will, over 2016, continue to see global demand increase. Maybe not at the same pace we thought it would have, especially with China and India's economy a little slower. But I think global demand will continue to increase. Supply will continue to be a little bit, hampered in some ways because non-OPEC countries like Canada, like the United States, pretty difficult to keep production levels up at $35 a barrel, especially in the United States right now. We are seeing some pullback. So I think those supply and demand fundamentals will kind of kick in more toward the end of the year. And that should support oil prices. My guess is that by the end of 2016, we'll still see prices back around that $50 or $55 range. So that's the good news, is that I think we can anticipate some modest recovery in oil prices. The bad news is $50 oil is still a really challengingly low price for a lot of producers in this province. I think $50 oil would bring back stability to the industry, but not growth. And it's the growth that has really been fueling this province over the last, between 2010 and 2014. Stability is good. It's sort of that saying, flat is the new up. And I think we'll get to flat, just stabilizing. And that should all actually help stabilize the job market as well in Alberta. And on the topic of the job market, we might as well bring this into the presentation right now. This morning's job market, 19,000 new jobs created in Alberta in March. This is the strongest monthly gain in over 2 years. The unemployment rate went from 7.9% to 7.1%. And I don't believe any of it. Well, in some ways, I'm not saying that Stats Canada, that the survey is wrong, but I think it's a great example of why you never want to look at 1 month of data too closely and make too many inferences. Because there's no way, I believe for a minute, that in March of 2016, the Alberta economy turned around on a dime and started showing this huge swell in employment. This just does not mesh with any of the other indicators, and it doesn't mesh with the anecdotal information that we're hearing from employers. I think it's a good reminder that the labor force survey is just that. It's a survey. It's only an estimate. And month after month, these things can, be wrong. Over a period of time, I think you get a better view of what's going on. But if you just look at 1 month in isolation, you're going to probably make some incorrect inferences. And I think it would be incorrect to suggest that March, that last month, that was the end of the recession, and now Alberta is surging a job market once again. When you look over the last 12 months, we are still down in total employment. And the unemployment rate, which currently, at least according to the March numbers, 7.1%, still much higher than it was a year or two ago. So, I don't think there's any question the Alberta job market has deteriorated and is still seeing some very difficult challenges. And I don't think that March's numbers indicate this is the end of it. In fact, and this is the part of the presentation I don't really like talking about, I do expect that over the next few months we will continue to see more job losses, particularly in the petroleum industry. Before, perhaps by the end of the year, if we can get that stability in oil price back to around 50, that should also then bring some stability back to the job market. And then we can look to see that unemployment rate maybe gradually coming back down in 2017 and beyond. I'll get back when I talk about the short-term forecast for Alberta. But for oil prices, I don't think we can anticipate any sharp rebound anytime soon, perhaps getting back to that $50 range by the end of the year. But just one more note on oil prices. We're coming up actually to an interesting anniversary. May 24th, 2004. Does anyone remember what you were doing on that day? Just about 12 years ago. May 24th was 04 was an important day because West Texas Intermediate smashed through an all-time record high. On May 24th, 2004, it hit $42 US a barrel. That was only 12 years ago. I mean, this wasn't 1904, this was 2004. And 12 years has made a huge amount of difference. Now, $42 isn't an acceptable price. But back in 2004, and by the way, Alberta's real GDP advanced 5.5% in 04. Now, much of that was on the back of natural gas, which was trading at $5.50. So natural gas really was the big driver at the time. But still, in 04, $42 oil was really starting to spur on a lot of investment in the oil sands and a lot of conventional drilling activity. It was raining money in downtown Calgary. I mean, those were the good days. But cost increases, especially labor, has increased over those last 12 years to the point where $42 doesn't make any sense anymore. I think the industry can find ways to get it down, maybe not to 42, but I think with enough time, the industry should be able to function at $50 or $60 WTI. I don't see why it can't. And this is where I like to bring our farmer friends into the equation, because when I give this statistic to farmers and I tell farmers, ooh, the petroleum sector is being hammered, lowest prices in 12 years. And they're like, wheat prices have been the same for 40 years. I mean, they can't really understand why this is so difficult. Yeah, agricultural commodities, they're always kind of up and down. But you know, you look at the longer term trend and things like wheat and cattle prices, they haven't really moved very much from where they were in 1976. So I think that there's some lessons actually that the petroleum sector can learn from agriculture, and the way that agriculture has constantly having to, increase efficiencies, keep costs in line, and they're always dealing with weather and everything else. Not an easy industry. But I think the petroleum sector, they will be able to, with enough time, get their costs down, get their efficiencies up, and I think $50 or $60 WTI will once again be an okay price. Not the good old days like 2013, 2014, but I think we will see some stability, but we're not there quite yet. All right, so let's turn now to Alberta's economy and talk about some of these long, medium, and short-term trends. And let's start first of all, let's go in reverse order. I want to talk first of all about the longer-term trend. So now what? Well, it seems like we just put away the party streamers and the noisemakers ringing in 2016, but let's talk about 2036. 20 years from now. Now some of you might think, well, that's so far into the future. How can you even think about 2036? Well, does anyone remember a couple of movies like Independence Day, Mission Impossible, Jerry Maguire? Those movies were 20 years ago. Hate to kind of ruin your day, but I mean, that's sort of what 20 years, in some ways it's a long time, but in another way, it's kind of, the blink of an eye and there we are. 2036, it's difficult to forecast with much accuracy where Alberta will be, where its economy will be. But I remain very optimistic for Alberta in 2036. I foresee a province that has exceeded 6 million people, because even during down years like 2015, 2016, Alberta's population continues to advance. Fewer interprovincial migrants, but natural population increase and international continues nonetheless. And when the economy picks back up, I think population growth will pick back up a bit. And sort of at those trends, Alberta's population will exceed 6 million by 2036. Both Calgary and Edmonton will be in that 1.5 to 1.7 million category. And other towns and cities and communities around the province will also continue to grow. When in 2036 they talk about the recession, they won't be talking about 2015, 2016. They might be talking about 2022. They might be talking about 2027, or maybe 2032. In other words, statistically anyway, if you look at past patterns, we are likely to see 2 or maybe 3 more recessions in this province between today and 2036. And it sounds glib to say this, and I don't mean it to sound trivial, but recessions come and recessions go, and this is not the last one we are going to see. And in 2036, the economy will have gone through probably a few more rounds of what we're going through. Hopefully not quite as deep and drawn out as this one, but recessions really are a normal part of the cycle in this province. 2036, I also do see a more diversified economy. I do see an economy that is, its energy sector has grown, but it is also expanded and diversified to include more non-hydrocarbon sources of energy. Hard right now to kind of see where that might be, but I think there's a really good chance that Alberta will be able to use its engineering expertise in hydrocarbons to tap into another form of energy, and that is geothermal energy, deep earth geothermal energy. I think Alberta has fantastic opportunities to develop that because it already builds on what we do well. We're really, really good at drilling through 4 kilometers of rock to get to something useful and valuable. And now, a lot of those engineers and geologists, they need something to do, you know, and maybe we can look at ways that we could sort of stimulate deep earth geothermal. But I see lots of options or lots of optimism for new forms of energy. And like what we were sort of talking about last night, you know, diversity really does involve working on our trump cards: agriculture and agri-food, tourism, forestry, and of course energy. I don't really see a lot of industries, you know, there's always going to be some, but I see in 2036 a lot more diversity in Alberta's economy, but built on those foundations that are already present. Let's turn to a little bit more, less far into the future. Let's talk about the year 2021. So now we're only talking 5 years into the future. Well, here it gets maybe a little bit more interesting, or maybe in some ways easier to forecast what's going to happen in 5 years. 2021, I'll put myself out on a limb, I'll say 2021 will be the first year since 2014 where real GDP growth exceeded 4%. In other words, I do see 4% growth coming back to Alberta, but probably not for another 4 or 5 years. I actually see the next 4 or 5 years kind of being a slow growth period for Alberta, simply because I'm not expecting those oil prices to get back above that, you know, $55, $60 range. So I think we are in for a few years of, for what Alberta would feel like is, you know, very sluggish growth. Growth probably closer to maybe 1.5 or 2.5%. Growth at most Canadian provinces, that's kind of the norm, you know. I always like to point out Manitoba. Anyone here? Probably half the audience here is from Manitoba. But Manitoba is, you know, it's sort of even Steven. It never booms, it never busts. It does have Canada's most economically diversified economy. Its provincial economy is the most diversified. But growth in Manitoba is always kind of plodding along between 1.5 and 2.5%. It never booms, it never busts. Manitoba and Alberta, this is the classic tortoise and the hare parable, right? And you know who wins the day in that story. So Manitoba, growth in that range. I think Alberta for the next few years, 4 or 5 years, will probably experience slower rates of growth as we diversify, as the energy sector struggles to get its costs down and lives in a world where the price environment is more modest rather than $107 oil. But I do see by 2021 a lot of growth coming back to Alberta, and I do see a vibrant economy in the next 5 years, or 5 years from now. But then let's talk about the more immediate future. Now I know everything is just budding out there and it's spring and tulips and everything. It almost seems shameful to start talking about leaves turning color and things getting colder. But let's talk about the autumn of 2016, about 6 months from now. What can we expect in that short term for Alberta's economy? And here, I would admit, is the toughest part of the presentation. I think the next 6 months for Alberta are going to be the toughest. I really do. The job market, when we see all those other indicators, retail sales, the housing market, I think most of the downward adjustment in all of it is going to happen between now and Thanksgiving. And I don't like to talk about that because I wish it wasn't the case, but I do think that given where oil prices are at and given that the petroleum sector is struggling to get its costs down, I think we will continue to see rounds of layoffs in the petroleum sector and also those peripheral sectors, manufacturing and construction and business services. So in other words, despite the really rip-roaring job report in March, I don't think we are through the worst of this downturn, at least not in terms of the job market. But I do see stability coming back by the fall of 2016 and then some very gradual improvements after that. Our forecast for ATB, or for Alberta's economy, ATB Financial, we do produce a quarterly forecast, and we're just in the midst right now of kind of finalizing our Q2 forecast, so we don't have the exact numbers, but it will be a forecast where we're looking at another year of contraction, probably in the range of 0.5 to 1%. contraction in Alberta's economy. That will, if that happens, that will mean a second consecutive year of contraction for Alberta. That might start to look a little bit like the 1980s. You know, some people will draw those comparisons. I still think the comparisons with the 80s are a bit overblown, especially when you talk about the job market and the housing market. I mean, today we're looking at 7–8% unemployment. In 1984, it was 12.5%. You know, the housing market. Well, these days, you know, even a city like Calgary that is very beholden to the energy sector, it's looking at year-over-year price decreases about 3 to 5%, maybe a bit more. How much was it in the 80s? 20%? You know? So I think mortgage rates, of course, were the big difference between the 80s and today. So I do think that this is going to be a very difficult downturn, 2015, 2016. I think the comparisons with the 1980s are probably a little bit overdone. But certainly for a generation that is coming into the job market in this decade, this is going to be a real challenge before it does start to turn around and stabilize and gradually improve. So with that, I want to conclude on this quote here. The best way to predict the future is to create it. And I know that this would resonate very well with everyone in this room. I mean, you wouldn't be in this room. Economic developers and farmers, they have to be the most optimistic people. Otherwise, you just wouldn't keep doing it, right? And I understand, I know that people in this room, this is what you're all about. And listening to the speeches last night and the awards ceremony last night, and Heather Anderson and her comments, I mean, this is what economic developers are all about. If you want to predict the future, to create it. And that's why I love being part of this, this conference every year, because of the energy and enthusiasm in this room, to not just predict Alberta's economy, but actually build it and create it. So with that, I will stop talking. I'll let you know really quickly. I tell you this every year, but in case this is the first year someone in this room has been here and you don't know about the OWL, this is our little daily newsletter that we send out every morning. We used to call it the Daily Economic Comment. And then I decided one day that is a terribly dull sounding name for anything. Who would sign up for something, volunteer to sign up for something called the Daily Economic Comment? It just sounds too boring. So we refreshened it. We call it the owl, the great horned owl, of course, Alberta's provincial bird. Owls are creatures that are very aware of what's going on around them. Nothing gets past an owl. So we call it the owl, and it's subtitled Focused on Alberta's Economy. It's a quick 60-second read every morning, usually some of the new numbers that Stats Canada has released. So this morning, for example, I wrote on Alberta's job market numbers, so that will be the owl today. And every day it's something different, but I think it gives a very good real-time read of what's going on in Alberta's economy. And as I said, it's quick 60-second read, nice plain language. So if you're interested, and it is of course entirely free, we're trying to get everyone in the province who's interested to sign up for it. So if you're interested, you can go to atb.com/economics.